Hello and welcome to episode 13 of the Brand Burger podcast. I'm your host, Braden Matson, strategy at Storybook Marketing. I'm excited about this one because we are going to go deep on category entry points, mental availability, how to use category entry points to grow mental market share over time, what that is, why it matters. We're also going to touch on how advertising works in this context and in this frame, and essentially how to use advertising um, to to increase mental availability and mental market share over time. We're also going to touch on how to use CEPs when you are a small brand, because that's something that can often be missed, I find. So, jumping straight into it, right? Mental availability is a relatively new concept. Started with, Byron Sharp and How Brands Grow, and it's been just slowly evolving and progressing since then. And I do believe that the mental and physical availability model of growth is the most scientifically robust and does actually explain every case of brand growth that you could throw out there. I think that mental and physical availability is able to account for how brands actually grow. And I didn't always think that. I've kind of gone back and forth on this, to be honest, but it is where I've landed. So, to kick off, what is mental availability? Mental availability means that your brand is thought of in a buying situation. So let's just take a brief step outward, zoom out for a second and define some other terms because mental availability is very different from awareness or brand awareness. So the way that the Aaron Bass kind of B2B Institute framing of this works is that awareness, and you can have aided and unaided, but we're not going to talk about that in this episode. Awareness at the kind of base layer is basically when you prompt someone with a category, a brand is named. And the difference between aided and unaided is whether or not you give a list of brands or not. But let's say, for example, we're having a conversation and I say to you, when you think of the car category, when you think of cars, what brands come to mind? You might say Porsche, Ford, and Mazda. I'm just making that up. It would be said that Mazda, Porsche, and Ford has brand awareness. That's essentially now you could do that in a survey and at scale, and then that's where the actual percentage or the metric would be assigned, right? So like let's say Mazda could do a survey of their market and they could just ask that initial question, and then let's just say 70% was their brand awareness. This would be considered like top of mind awareness. Up from this then is salience, which is I name the brand or you name the brand, a human names the brand first when prompted by the category. So if I say, when you think of cars, what brand immediately comes to mind? You say Mazda. That means Mazda is very salient for you. Now, this is where we get into the really important difference. Salience and mental availability are very different in the most crucial aspect, which is that mental availability has to do with buying situations. What does that mean? Well, a buying situation is when something in my internal or external environment changes such that I am going to buy from a category. This could be any category. And this is what a category entry point is. What happens is as you go through your life, whether you are on your job and you're tasked with buying enterprise software, or you are buying a car for yourself in your personal life, you are cued with something. There is some kind of cue in the world or in your internal state. Internal state could be I'm hungry or tired. External could be my girlfriend totaled my car and I need a new one now, right? So there's some kind of cue. Now, in both of those cases, I don't control the cues. I don't control the cues. What happens is things in my life happen, and I am cued with something that is going to get me to buy from the category. Now, the way this actually works is this is referred to as cued retrieval. And this is how we're getting into mental availability and the importance of memories. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist. My sister-in-law is. It's very impressive. I'm not, but we can still kind of understand these concepts. Cued retrieval means that when you are cued by something in the environment, your brain, in order to address the thing in the environment or solve the problem or meet the need, immediately scans your memories for matching solutions or associations. So when I think I'm thirsty, depending on where I am in my environment, if I'm in the middle of a desert and I think that, my brain is going to have different memories than if I'm at the gym, for example, because I can just go and fill up my water bottle when I'm at the gym. So cued retrieval means there's a cue in the environment, internal or external or both, and then my mind retrieves a memory that is the content of the memory is designed to help me address whatever is the problem or the need or the situation. So that's the process of cued retrieval. And the point of mental availability is that what you want is you want the content of that memory to be your brand in the buying situation. Another example to make this really simple to understand. Let's imagine that I'm tasked with finding a CRM for our company. That's the cue. There's going to be some cue where, let's say my boss comes to me and says, I want you to help us find a CRM. That would be considered a category entry point. Okay, so the category entry point in the queue, it's the same thing. Another category entry point might be that I just notice one day that we're doing something inefficiently, and now I'm going to go and take it on myself to find a CRM. That's a different category entry point, right? And so the point there is that when there's a queue, the first thing I'm going to do is my mind is going to search my memories for what's associated with that queue, and then it's going to give me, in this case, brands because I'm buying from the CRM category. And so for me, Salesforce and HubSpot are top of mind. They are mentally available for me. They come to mind when I think CRM. If I was a consultant, maybe I would think Copper. This is where we really start to get into the importance of understanding category entry points and mental availability. So that's what mental availability is. Again, it's coming to mind in a buying situation. And again, that's so crucial because we make decisions contextually, right? The ice cream that I choose when I'm having a cheat day is different from the ice cream that I choose if I want to still hit my calorie targets, right? Totally different brands, different situations. This is why situational awareness is so important to understand. Your brand competes at the level of the situation, of the context, not just the category, right? The categories are very big, and in fact, categories are technically non-existent. I mean, they don't have ontology. They're not real things. They're just mental tags. So your brand competes at the level of the situation. So mental availability means your brand comes to mind in buying situations based on cued retrieval. Okay, so there's a cue, there's a situation. I search my memories. You want the content of that memory, which is the category entry point, is the cue. You want your brand to come to mind. That's mental availability. Now, mental market share, then it follows from that, is essentially, or share of mind, right? You might hear these terms, and they're very important to understand. Mental market share, or share of mind, is the percentage of category entry points for which your brand is present. Believe it or not, you can actually measure this. And this is one of the reasons why I say that I think that this model of the world is the most scientifically accurate with respect to marketing. You can actually measure this. And the way that you do that, and like similar to aided versus unaided, I'm not going to go down a giant rabbit hole now because that's not the main subject. We have a lot to get through in this episode, but you can measure this, in the way that you would do it is you would plot out all of your CEPs, which we're going to talk about, and then you would survey the market with ideally a representative sample of the market, and you would just simply ask, for the following situations, please, I'm so Canadian about it, apparently, please list the brands that come to mind in the following situations. And then you literally tally this up, right? And so when you do that survey, you can use like Winter, you can use Qualtrics. There's self-serve ways to do this that are not super expensive. You can do this right now with your brand. And then when you export that data, you're actually going to get to see a snapshot essentially of the total number of category entry points associated with each brand. That's what mental market share is. And there's also a relationship between mental market share, share of mind, and actual market share. So we know how important this is. And we know that in order to grow, you need to increase your mental market share over time as well as your physical availability. But in this episode, we're focused on mental availability and share of mind. So that's what mental market share is. And like I said, it's actually measurable. You can do this with hard data and then present it to your CFO or CMO and help you use it to ground strategic thinking, which I also want to touch on. So that's mental availability. That's mental market share. We talked about what a category entry point is and its relationship to queued retrieval as it relates to memories and the buying process. Now I want to talk about how do you actually identify and prioritize category entry points. So there is a process that you can use, and that's what we use at Storybook, and it gives you some data and some numbers here to actually begin putting this into practice. This is not theoretical. If I make one thing in this episode clear, or if you come away with one thing, it's to understand that this is not theoretical. This is doable for basically every company. Every company. This is doable. This is strategic. This is scientifically, I mean, I hesitate a little bit to say scientifically, but let's just say empirically and reasonably validated. Okay, so none of this is like pie in the sky. This is, you can do this right now, and it's the most accurate empirical evidence that we have with respect to how brands grow. So how do you actually choose category entry points? The best way, or I say best because I'm thinking about budget here. If you're a huge company, I mean, you can spend thousands on lots of surveys, right? If you're a SMB or even mid-market company, where I would start is I would do customer interviews. And I don't want to get into the entire framework. I mean, you can Google it, or as like I always say, just DM me on LinkedIn, and we can chat through this. But essentially, there's what the B2B Institute and Ehrenberg Bass refer to as like the 5 Ws framework. It's essentially like who, what, where, when, why. And you go through with each of those lenses with your customers to understand basically the context or the situation that they were in when they bought the product. And if you do this with 10 to 15 customers and you use that framework, what you're going to come away with is a whole big list. All right. So just to give you some examples, right? Like, let's imagine you are a CRM and you talk to your customers and you go through this framework. You might come away with, I started a new job and I needed to find a CRM. I noticed that we were doing it in a really bad way and I needed to find a CRM. I noticed that we were using this CRM over here, but it sucks, so I needed to find a CRM. You see how all of these are different category entry points, and they all are going to have different associated credibility, commonness, and there's one more C there that we're going to talk about. But the point there is that you're going to come away with all of these category entry points when you do this exercise. And if you're not talking to customers, I'm sorry, but you're not doing marketing. Like, it's hard. Sometimes you have to incentivize customers, but doing good work is hard, right? So AI plays a role here, but I would still recommend that for this CEP gathering exercise, talk to your customers 10 to 15, right? And gather you're going to have a big list of CEPs. The next step from there is to cull that list to weed out any duplicates or ones that are really, really similar to get it down to a unique list. Then from there, this is where the quantitative data comes in and where I say you can use a tool like Winter or Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey if you're in B2C. You can use any self-serve survey platform to literally you build a survey with a representative sample of your market, ideally. Even if it's not representative, it does allow you to, and you can't afford a representative sample, you can still use a sample. And what you do is you put all of these CEPs in a survey question, and the survey question is, for the following situations, please rank, or not, you're not actually using, I shouldn't say rank, it's please select the brands that come to mind. And you want to make sure this has been validated by Ehrenberg Bass, and this is their perspective, that you want to give a choose any option here. So in the survey question, you say, please select the brands that come to mind. So you have your list of CEPs, right? So you've started with customer research. Now you've called the list, you have this big list. And then maybe some of them are totally irrelevant too. So you go through, you have the relevant ones. Now what you do, because you've asked your customers as well, like who else have you considered? So you have your list of you have your competitive set. For each one, you ask in the survey question to slot in the brands that come to mind for that CEP. And you want to make sure you randomize the brands so that you don't bias the results. When you get that, what you're going to then get essentially is data that you can now use to put through the following filters. So once you have data behind the CEPs, and just as a side note, if your company is very resistant to doing research like this, you can do this by basically just guessing with your team. You shouldn't, frankly. You should, if your company's not willing to spend 5 or 10 grand on a market research survey that is going to give you literally the most important strategic information that you are going to need all year and for the next few years, then I mean, that's just not level-headed thinking. But in any case, you can do this without survey data. It's just less ideal. So once you have this data, there are 3 primary filters we need to put the CEPs through. Okay, so the first one is credibility. And the B2B Institute has a really good document called category entry points for the B2B world, something like that, where they actually walk through how to score your category entry points from your survey data based on credibility. And what you will do, and it's a little too complicated mathematically. I mean, it's quite straightforward, but it's too complicated to walk through verbally. So again, if you have any questions, you can DM me on that on LinkedIn. But what you end up with is a matrix where you're actually going to have CEPs for each that you've asked in your survey, right? And then you're going to have all of your competitors, and you're going to have where you're going to be able to score those CEPs mathematically. You're going to be able to score them so you can put positive and negative numbers to credibility. For example, you might find like if you were working for HubSpot, you do this exercise and you find that one of the category entry points is I'm switching from a bad CRM, and you're actually going to be able to see on that CEP where your competitors are from a credibility perspective. It might be, let's say, -5, -4, and maybe you are +1 or 2. So once you have this whole matrix built out, it gives you the ability to now prioritize CEPs based on credibility. For example, if you're really lacking credibility in one CEP compared to your competitors, and your budget is limited, and you're in a growth stage, but you probably want to prioritize some other ones where you're a little bit more credible. Or if you're like a -1 or a 0 and your competitors are also lacking, that might be one to focus on. So instantly you get this really great data-backed visual and tool to help you prioritize the category entry points based on credibility. Now, the next filter we have to use here is actually also credibility, but it's internal credibility. So it's a subset of credibility externally, because the data that you get is purely external credibility. It's about how other companies perceive you based on those category entry points. Internal credibility really is just making sure that for the CEPs that you've selected, that the product doesn't F you. Because what could happen here is that you select 3 category entry points, but the product and the solution that you are assigning to from a physical availability perspective does not satisfy the needs of that category entry point, right? So that's where you need to do the internal review to make sure that you have internal credibility of those category entry points so that you're not screwed when you go to market. So that's the first filter, is credibility. The second one is competitiveness or competition. So you want to, for each of the ones that you've selected, and it's a bit of a mix, like the filters kind of combine, right? So for each of the category entry points, you're kind of doing all 3 filters at the same time. Competitiveness basically means, do we stand a chance here based on how credible we are as well as our product, right? So if you have a category entry point that is really, really that is just simply too competitive to focus on right now based on your competitor's dominance of that credibility primarily and your own product and their product, then that would be one that you probably don't want to focus on. The third filter is commonness. So this is essentially how often or how present is this category entry point? And the way that you can think about this basically is what is the commercial value of this category entry point? Now, you can kind of work that out because all category entry points are segments, but not all segments are category entry points. And the reason for that is that a good segment ideally is behavioral. And so a category entry point is basically just a market segment. So you can kind of work out based on what that category entry point is and doing a little bit of research. You can combine AI and Google and the customers that you've talked to get a sense of how frequent or how common this category entry point is. For example, switching CRMs is going to be more common than some super, super obscure CEP that I would have to think up off the top of my head, right? So commonness is also another one. You want to make sure that there's enough commercial viability in that category entry point to actually proceed forward with it. So that's how to find and prioritize category entry points, right? So we have a huge list, we call the list, then we get some data behind it, then we put them through those three main filters, and now you have, let's say, 3 to 8. And so this is where now we really have to choose based on our advertising budgets. And I'm actually going to touch briefly on, like I said, how advertising works, but also using the principle of excess share of voice to help us understand that when you are a huge company, things are different in the way that you approach this to when you're a small company. So when you are a market leader, you should be focused on improving your mental market share for every one of your CEPs, right? But when you're a smaller company, you simply cannot afford to do that. And so the strategy there, this is where the strategic part of this is so incredibly important, is because if you are a challenger brand in a very big market with 1,500 other solutions just like yours, you probably don't have the budget for more than two CEPs at one time. And in fact, depending on the commercial size, the revenue potential of those CEPs, probably even one, right? Now, this is actually what's funny about this is that this is how brands grow. When you look at small brands that become big brands, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon, Lululemon, Gymshark, they all start with like one or two category entry points. I mean, Amazon started with books online, right? So like I want to buy a book. Amazon, there you go. And now, I mean, we don't have to talk about how big Amazon is. Facebook, same thing. Facebook was like, I want to meet new people at Harvard, or I want to make more friends at Harvard, right? And then all of a sudden, now Facebook is what they are, or I suppose I should say Meta or Feta. If you haven't seen that meme, just Google Mark Zuckerberg Feta. It's hilarious. The point there is when you're a small brand, you need to prioritize category entry points. And as you grow, you can continue to scale your mental market share. So this is where now we're getting into how to do this with advertising and the actual point of advertising. So the point of advertising is to continually nudge your market's propensity to buy you in buying situations over time. That's the point of advertising. And it's a relatively low effect, but it just like 1% better every day, compounding interest, it works in the same way. And we know that advertising works because in there's one particular study where I forget exactly the source, but they looked at brands that were willing to cut off advertising spend, all of their advertising spend, and what they found is that nothing happened right away. But when you look months and years down the line, sales just tank, right? And so advertising is both defensive and offensive. Let's talk about the offensive part because this is really where the growth happens. So There's a principle called excess share of voice, which I'm a huge fan of, and it's still quite validated. It goes all the way back to Nielsen in the 70s, and it's been validated by the work of Bennett and Field via IPA and some others as well. So it's Mark Ritson refers to it as marketing gravity. It's essentially the principle says that in order to grow, you need an excess share of voice. Okay, well, what the heck is that? Well, you have share of voice, which is the percentage of media spend that is yours in the category. So if I'm HubSpot, how much media spend is in the CRM category? Like from, Salesforce is going to be in there, Oracle is going to be in there. Do they have a CRM? I'm not a boomer. There's going to be all the CRMs, and they're going to spend money on media. Share of voice is your percentage of that media spend, and the relationship between share of voice and share of market, in other words, your share of voice and market share, has been validated as very closely matching. So if you have a 5% share of voice, you tend to have about a 5% market share. The reason that's important is because what excess share of voice says is that in order to grow, you must have a bigger share of voice, in other words, higher media spend than your market share is, and you must sustain that for a period of a year if you want to grow market share in a year. Now you could shorten this to a month or a quarter, but generally because growth happens over a long period of time, because for every 10-point increase in excess share of voice or every 10 points of excess share of voice you have, you can expect about a 0.5% increase in market share. Now, what you might think is, well, that's not that much, but if you're in a billion-dollar market, it actually is. And so you need to make sure that you are budgeting for growth here. And so this is how advertising comes into play. And so what I want to do is close this out by weaving all of these pieces in together. So what you have is you have your category entry points that you've chosen to focus on. Then from there, what you need to understand is you need to be able to budget for growth by using the principle of excess share of voice. I have a tool here. If you want that tool, I think it's pretty cool. You can DM me on LinkedIn and I'll send it over to you. It's a spreadsheet that'll help you calculate this. But the point is, if you can't budget for growth, you can't expect growth, and it's a challenge. Is that if you're super small company, you can still run ads, but I mean then that's where I'm gonna say like, okay, one category entry point, one product, go hard on content, and then pay distribution from there. But the point is, you need to work out if you want to grow, you need to work out what your budget is going to need to be for that, and excess share of voice helps you make the financial case for it. And then for each of your category entry points, what you want to be able to do is with your communications, marketing communications, both paid and organic and direct mail and all of the tactical pieces, you want to denote whether you're trying to create this memory structure or refresh it. So what I mean by that is advertising is designed previously to do what I said, but the way that it does it is it either creates a new memory or it refreshes an existing memory. Remember, we talked about memories and their importance and the fact that you want the content of the memory to be the brand itself. I'll give you an example. Before I knew about Vrbo, I would have just used Airbnb, but now I know about Vrbo, and if I ever want to rent a vacation home, I'm going straight to Vrbo and I'm going to bypass Airbnb because they've solidified that memory in my mind. So the first time I saw a Vrbo ad, what it was doing was it was actually creating the memory. It was putting the memory in my head for the first time. Now every subsequent ad is refreshing that so that they need to do that to make sure that the period in between each of those impressions is not long enough that I totally forget about Vrbo. Now, I can forget a little bit. There's actually some benefit there. If I forget a tiny little bit and then they refresh it again, because it forces the memory to be implanted a little bit stronger. But the point is, they need to make sure that I don't forget about Vrbo. Because if I forget, then I'm going to choose Airbnb. And so that's where the refreshing comes in. And so for each of these CEPs with your media plan, you can plot out whether you are trying to create or refresh the memory structures, and you'll know if you're creating or refreshing because if you have no credibility or low credibility, you're probably going to be creating versus if you have a lot of credibility already on that CEP, like we talked about with credibility, you're probably going to be refreshing. And then that's going to dictate the creative strategy that you're using as well. And so for each of those CEPs, you want to plot out whether you're creating or aiming to refresh those memory structures. And then that's also then going to inform channels and content as well. And the beautiful thing is that once you have these CEPs prioritized, now you can actually plot out all of your tactical execution. You can plot out your long-term brand building. You can plot out your direct response because you can target the companies that are in market with those CEPs and target the 95% roughly of companies that are out of market with those CEPs. The whole beautiful puzzle just starts to come together when you do this. So that is the end here. The last thing I wanted to just finish on, like I said, is just a reminder. I touched on it, but how to use this when you're a small brand. So again, I just want to be really clear that when you're a small brand, you do not have the luxury to focus on all category entry points. Do not confuse this with broad reach. When you're a small brand, you should be targeting for your brand marketing and your long-term efforts, you should be targeting the whole market. But the segmentation part, the category entry point focus part, is applied at the level of the category entry point, not the level of the targeting necessarily. So what I mean by that is you can target your whole market with one category entry point. What you might find is that you should restrict your targeting in that market a little bit and still with that one category entry point. But remember, the more you target, generally speaking, the worse the data is, the worse the results are from CPM perspective and a CPA perspective. So do not hyper target. You should target the whole category with your long-term brand messaging. Even if you're a small company, it's just where the focus is not at the level of the targeting necessarily. It could be, but probably not. The focus is going to be at the level of the category entry point. That's where you're focusing in. And then that's where the creative and all of the other tactical execution is going to be focused around that category entry point. Everything flows from there, but you can still target the whole market for long-term brand building. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions about this, DM me on LinkedIn. I always love to chat. I offer free strategy calls as well for any company who just is struggling with growth or has questions about marketing. Been in 5 agencies and freelancing, consulting, started e-commerce companies, and so I'm a bit of a dork and I love to talk about this stuff. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or if you want to be a guest on the show too. I do love talking to people who are way smarter than me. The bar's not that high, but I do love it. So if you want to be a guest, also message me on LinkedIn. This has been a fun one. Thank you for listening. And until next episode, all of the best to you. Thank you.